My name's Elaine Wright, and I work for the South East Wales Biodiversity Record Centre, or SUBREC for short, because that's quite a mouthful. So today we're working with Bumblebee Conservation Trust with Clare Flynn, who is going to be talking to you today about the beginner bumblebees that you might find in your garden. I'm just going to do a 3-minute presentation quickly about what SUBREC is, just in case you've never heard of us. So what is SUBREC? So we're a local environmental record centre. And we've got a few main aims. The big thing that we do is to gather together data to provide to local decision makers and to national researchers. So we'll take data, so wildlife sightings and other information from individuals such as yourself, so individual wildlife recorders, from organisations like the wildlife trusts, and from national bodies like Natural Resources Wales. And we put it all together into one big pot, and then we can provide that information out to decision makers, so planning departments, unitary authorities, people who are building housing estates and stuff, and also to students and other researchers for long-term projects. Another big thing that part of what we do is to support individual recorders. So that might be through technical assistance, running courses like this one to help people improve their skills, funding in some cases, events, anything we can do to help those people who are out there in the field creating data. And we also encourage and celebrate recording in our area. So we'll run introductory courses for recording to get new people on board, and also run events like our annual conference and have a newsletter that just showcase the great work that's being done by wildlife recorders in South East Wales. We have an office in Talbot Green. We haven't been in it very much for the past 18 months, but it is there. But we actually cover all of Gwent and Glamorgan. So that's from Monmouth in the east to Gower in the west, and then from the coastline up to the edge of the Brecon Beacons National Park. And we've got 7 staff members, which doesn't sound that big, but some record centres only have 1 or 2. So we are quite large in the scheme of things. And just to give a little bit of context to us, we are one of 4 record centres in Wales. So you can see on the left-hand side here, there's 1 in Mid Wales, 1 in West Wales, and 1 in North Wales. And we're also part of a bigger network that covers all of the United Kingdom. So wherever you are in the UK, you probably have a record centre covering your area. And these are just some useful links to our website and our social media and stuff like that. But don't worry about scribbling them down, because I'll email them out afterwards as well. And I'll hand over to Claire, who's going to tell us about bumblebees.
Okay, thanks, Elaine.
Stop sharing.
Right. Okay, I'll just share my screen. How's that, Elaine? Can you see? I can't hear you. Can you give me a thumbs up?
Yes, you just need to put it into slideshow mode, I think. Yeah, that's great.
Is that okay? Great. Okay. Well, yeah. Thanks to Elaine and SUBREC for partnering up with Bumblebee Conservation Trust for this pair of training sessions, which we're going to do this week and next week. I'm really delighted to be working with all 4 record centres across Wales. And my job as project officer for Skills for Bees is to work with established recorders, but also people who are completely new to recording or to bumblebees, to give you the skills to begin to identify bumblebees to species. And crucially, hopefully, what we'd love you to do is to submit your sightings as biological records. So these 2 beginner sessions will be session 1, and we'll go right back to basics. So I really apologise if you're quite knowledgeable about bumblebees, because I am going to take it from a complete beginner level. And after tea, then we will begin to look at the most common 8 species, which both of these sessions will focus on. And then next week we'll take that a bit further, going into detail with males and females, etc. And Elaine and I together will do a little bit more on how we can submit that data and make it valuable for conservation and science and research and policy, etc. There's a huge lack of bumblebee data in Wales. We have enormous gaps geographically across Wales. I have to say the Subrec area is relatively well recorded, although there are still gaps, because the Bumblebee Conservation Trust has done quite a lot of work in the past in South Wales, right from Monmouth to Pembrokeshire, basically along the M4 corridor and below, south of it. But in Mid and North Wales, we have very little data on how our bumblebees are doing. So my project is primarily to try and train enough people across Wales to submit data so that we can really fill those gaps. And these sessions, these 2 weeks are very much part of that. Okay, so we'll go, like I said, we're going to go right back to basics. And just a little tiny bit on bees in general. Most of these photographs are from my garden, all three of those actually, and almost all from Pembrokeshire. And in the UK, we have around about 275 species of bee. Okay, so you know, quite a diverse bee fauna. There's probably about 25,000 species in the world altogether, but nobody really knows that total number because there's a lot of species that probably haven't been described yet. And we split them into 3 broad groups, which I'm sure some of you may be aware of, especially Andy, being a beekeeper. So this is a honeybee worker, Apis mellifera. And we only have one biological species of honeybee in the UK. There are within that, there are varieties. So they might vary in colour somewhat, and you might have heard of different types of variety of honeybee, but they are all the same species. Solitary bees are an incredibly diverse and numerous group. So they, in terms of species number, they make up the majority of our bee diversity in the UK and in the world. We've got about 245 species in the UK. It varies slightly because some years wildlife recorders might occasionally find a species that hasn't been recorded here before, and it gets added to the UK list. And there are some species that are very, very close to extinction. So those are the ones that vary slightly. And of course, bumblebees, which will be our topic of learning for the next 2 weeks. And we have 24 species currently in the UK. Sometimes you might see 25 quoted because there was an attempt at a reintroduction down in Kent, but we're not quite sure if that's worked, of the short-haired bumblebee, which had previously gone extinct in around 1980. So we're at 24 at the moment, and all bar one have been recorded in Wales, though many not for a long time, I have to say, which is why we're desperate for more up-to-date information. So just to summarise some key kind of features of each of the groups, all of our extant bee species are evolved from wasps, and they essentially evolved to take advantage of pollen, which started to be produced when flowering plants evolved. I think the earliest fossilised bee is something like about 80 million years old. And basically wasps back through time, some species started to gather pollen to feed their young rather than feeding their young insects. And gradually that evolutionary path evolved into the diversity of bee species we have today. So they're essentially, all bees, you might say, are vegetarian wasps. But honeybees, as I've said, one species in the UK. I don't know much about honeybees compared to the solitaries and bumbles, but I know that they live in a colony, and there's a kind of evolutionary progression there in that their social behaviour is perhaps the most complex. In the UK, they're largely domesticated for their honey, but there are many feral colonies as well. They have a barbed sting, so that sort of urban myth, if you like, that bees always sting when die when they sting you is pretty much only honeybees, because the barb will stick into your skin and it can damage the bee, causing death as they pull away. But I'm a bit worried Andy might correct me on some of this. This is about my sum total of knowledge of honeybees, I have to say. They are what we call corbiculate bees, in that they are able to attach pollen into a pollen lump mixed with sticky nectar, and they put it on their hind leg there, which we call the pollen basket. So they're very, very highly specialised in that sense. And the very special thing, I suppose, about honeybees is that because they make honey, the whole colony pretty much can survive the winter. And there isn't like a mass death of the colony, providing they have enough honey. So that their evolved sort of life history pattern allows them to survive in a temperate climate as a colony. Okay, so bumblebees as a group, they're all vegetarian, as all bees, 24 species, as I've said. And like honeybees, they are also social, living in a colony with a queen and her female daughter workers. So we call those the caste with bumblebees. The queen is one caste, the female workers are another, and then you have the males. And we don't tend to call them drones like we do with honeybees. We just call them males. Bumblebees, what I should say as well is that the social behaviour is probably not as complex as it is with honeybees either. There's no swarming, and they don't have the waggle dance or that sort of level of communication. Our 24 species are all native and mostly wild, though we do buy in colonies from a big factory in the Netherlands. I'm fairly sure I always get mixed up between Holland and Belgium, which is awful, but we buy colonies from this big factory to pollinate our indoor crops like early tomatoes and things like that, because bumblebees, there are some plants like tomatoes requiring buzz pollination, and bumblebees are very, very effective at that. So they have huge commercial value. They have a smooth sting, which I know from experience. They can happily fly off and sting again. Like the honeybees, they are corbiculate. They have pollen baskets, and you can see this queen bufftail. She has a triangular hind leg, which is specially adapted to carry a pollen load. But unlike honeybees, they don't make honey in any sort of real sense. And the colony doesn't survive the winter generally in a temperate climate. It dies off, and the mated queens hibernate alone. We will revisit all of these details about bumblebees. So that's quite a different life cycle, though now in the southeast of England, we are having colonies keeping going and just not hibernating, but just forming a new colony and a new one and a new one, because it's warm enough and there's enough plant cover in gardens, etc., for them to forage through the winter. So there is a slight change in that, but mostly they hibernate. And solitary bees, because there are so many different species, they are actually quite a complex group with quite many different life histories, but by and large, with some exceptions, they are not social insects. So the females work alone to build a nest and provision their eggs, and then they seal the nest up and it is left. So there's no parental care like there is in all sister care in the other two groups. There are some exceptions, but not many. Again, I've put in there that they're wild, but there are some solitary bees available commercially for things like pollinating orchards. And I know in North America they're used extensively on that sort of commercial basis, but almost always all the species we have are wild. Smooth sting, often too small to cause any damage to a person, depending on the species. They don't have their corbicular hind leg like the honeys and the bumbles. They actually carry the pollen dry on specialised hairs on their bodies, and the position of those hairs varies from species to species. So they're incredibly effective pollinators because the pollen remains loose on their bodies, so it's easily transported from plant to plant. And in contrast to the others, they actually survive our temperate winter by overwintering. All the adults die off and the young overwinter within the nest, sort of before they've actually molted to their final adult stage. So they remain as pupae in a kind of penultimate molt state, if you like, before they emerge then in the spring or summer the following year. And that's how they survive in that completely dormant state. So that's it on honeybees and solitary bees. We shall move on more to bumbles. And as I've already said, we'll whiz through these. They are incredibly important pollinators for our wildflowers, but also lots and lots of food crops are very dependent on bumblebees. I know farmers in Australia despair because they're not allowed to import bumblebees for pollination because there are no native bumblebees in Australia. And they were taken to New Zealand by colonial travellers back in the last century and even before that. And they've wreaked havoc on some of their floral sort of systems and plant pollinator interactions because of them not being native. But farmers in Australia often have to do a lot of their pollination by hand. So they are incredibly important, and obviously for the wider landscape, they're also very, very important. And as I'm sure you know, there's so much that can be said on this, but I'm sure you've all read and heard about bees being in trouble. I think they get a lot of publicity partly because they're very appealing and they have a huge economic value. So governments are on the case with pollinators. Academics have got lots of funding for research in recent decades as well. But of all the different things that threaten bees in particular, the biggest challenge in the last 70 years has been habitat loss through changes in farming methods. So the move after the Second World War from less intensive smaller farms with hay meadows and clover leas and lots of hedgerows, all of that loss had a massive impact on bumblebees, bigger than use of pesticides and herbicides, although obviously they contributed. And of course now changes in climate are affecting them as well. But the change to a very uniform landscape. I know that cereal crop, I should change that to perhaps in Pembrokeshire here, I'm just surrounded by silage fields, which are cut, 2 or 3 times a year, and they're completely devoid of any food or nesting sites for bumblebees. So in a little bit more detail, the first sort of real study of that decline, looking back at records from biological recorders, naturalists, going back to 1900, found that over a third of our social bumblebees, I'll explain why we've said social bumblebees there in a bit, have declined drastically, and that's in their ranges. So they've become very restricted and no longer widespread over the UK. 2 of our native species went extinct during the 20th century, and it was in the latter half, sort of after 1950. And the picture is very similar in Wales, although, like I've already said, we're really lacking up-to-date information on many species. So there's 5 species that are on our Section 7 list, which is those with conservation concern. The shrill carder, which I'm sure you've heard of, and it's in your area, one of the last remaining populations on the Gwent levels. The brown-banded carder, the moss carder, the red-shanked carder, and the ruderal bumblebee. You don't have to, remember these. We won't be doing these in this course. I've never seen a red-shanked carder or a ruderal bumblebee, and there are very, very few records in Wales, but they were here. So it'd be amazing, if we found that they still were. So hence the current project. Okay, and very quickly, the trust was set up by Professor Dave Goulson about 10 years ago, and he's an academic. He's a professor now down at Sussex, but with a life fascination with bumblebees, and he set up the trust to provide a more grassroots approach to their conservation, and because of his legacy, we are an organisation that's very, very much rooted in science. So even though we've become much wider than that, and we do a lot of work with schools and communities and lots of conservation work with landowners, etc., we're still fundamentally a scientific and science-led organisation, and this project is actually part of the science arm, if you like, of the trust, because the data will be used in that way, in research and feeding down then to conservation. Okay, so a little bit more now, getting into thinking about what bumblebee is and how we identify them. So yeah, I've just thrown a few words in there that I've collected over the years from different people when I've been out and about talking about bumblebees, and they are very appealing. There's no doubt that bumblebees are a brilliant group of insects to learn about and to start recording with, because their behaviour is fascinating. They're very fuzzy, they're very cute, brilliant pollinators, etc., and that's how people tend to think of them. And of course, they are invertebrates. They don't have a bony skeleton. They have a hard exoskeleton. They're arthropods, and within that, they are typical insects. So they have a 3-part body, which we'll look at in a sec, and a typical insect life cycle of an egg, larvae, pupae, and adult. Within the insects, they are what we call hymenopterans, which literally means membrane winged, because they have 4 pairs of wings, 4 wings, not 4 pairs, two pairs, which are separate, but they have this fabulous little row of hooks, which they basically fix together like Velcro when they're in flight, and it forms a membrane. And within the hymenopterans, we've got sawflies, bees, wasps, and ants. And then within that, the stinging hymenopterans are the aculeata, and that is bees, wasps, and ants. So in those groups, the females all have a sting, which is evolved from the egg-laying ovipositor of their waspy ancestors. Okay, so the males don't have the kit. Basically, males can't sting. They're completely harmless in all bees. And all of our bumblebees are in the same genus. So if you don't know what that is, it's So their Latin name begins with bombus, and they're all incredibly closely related. Okay, that's what that common generic name tells us. So if you remember, I said a couple of slides back about many of our social bumblebees having declined since 1900. And just to take a bit more detail about their behaviours, I told you we had 24 species and they were social like the honeybees, but there is a slight split in that. We have 18 who are what we call truly social bumblebees, where we have a colony with a queen bee and her worker daughters. But 6 of the species in this genus, so still very closely related, basically flaunt these rules, and they've evolved a rather sneaky life history. And these 6 species, the cuckoo bumblebees, actually behave like cuckoos on their social bumblebee counterparts. And what they do with the cuckoo bumblebees, there's only males and females. There's no caste. There's no worker bumblebees. There's no caste differentiation. So they have males and females, and the females will go in to the nest of a social bumblebee. So they'll go into a nest like this, and they will fight and kill or expel the social queen from the nest, the queen that has built that nest up. And all her workers are in there. And the cuckoo bumblebee female will then behave as the queen, and she will control the workers. She'll lay her own eggs of her own species in the nest, but she will get the workers from the other queen to bring them all up and do all the work. Okay, so they live in far lower numbers than their social hosts, as we call them, but they are around. They never diminish the social bumblebees to any level. They live in perfect balance with each other. So it's a very natural relationship, but it is a bit tough on the individual queens who started their nests and often have to fight to the death to defend them. So we will touch on the cuckoos in these 2 weeks because it's good to be aware of them, and they're often quite fascinating to see. But we're not going to worry too much because they're quite hard to ID. So when we start identifying bumblebees, we use a tiny bit of technical language, but not much at all. And as I said earlier, they are insects. So they have 3 body parts: the head, the thorax, and the abdomen. And there are segments within those parts as well. The legs and the wings come off the thorax. Okay, so you can see there the thorax is this bit with the head at one end and the abdomen at the other. There is a wasp waist, you know, just like a wasp, but it's not very obvious underneath all that fuzz, but it is there. So the abdomen begins at that sort of constricted part of the bee there at the waist. And we also talk about the end of the abdomen being the tail. So we talk very much about tail colour when we get into identification. There is no actual tail. It's just the latter few segments on the abdomen having different coloured hair. Okay. And there's a bald bumblebee. It doesn't look too well, actually. Its wings are really mashed as well. But they do lose their hair through the summer, especially the workers that are in and out of the nest all the time. And then you can see what we call the integument, which is that hard exoskeleton. And in all bumblebees, it's black. So the colour is purely the hair, and underneath they all look pretty much the same in the field if they were to go this bald, which is rare. So you can see, you can see the thorax there and the waist and the abdomen. Okay, so I'm going to take you through some illustrations of an annual life cycle for our British bumblebees, which is a bit generalised because there are slight variations, but this really helps in identification, and it really helps when you're beginning. If you're a complete beginner, it's really great because you can begin to put in context when, you know, if it's a particular time of year, like now in sort of mid to late May, what am I likely to see at that time and what behaviour am I seeing? Because you'll have an idea of the stage that a bumblebee is at and that the colony is at. So in the early spring, when the willow is out, for example, we begin to see the first queens emerging from hibernation. And these queens will have mated the season before. So she carries the sperm inside her and she doesn't use it until she chooses to. So the males are long dead and not needed. She's completely self-sufficient. And the first thing she does is feed on early pollen and nectar. So if you're a keen gardener, sources early flowering, really good for queen bumbles. Willow is brilliant. And you will see, I'm sure you will have seen earlier in the spring, big queen bumbles buzzing, really deep, lovely buzz, and they zigzag over the ground looking for a nest site. And that's typical queen behaviour. The workers and the males don't do that at all. So that's zigzagging over the undergrowth and digging in, that's typical queens. And when she's found a spot, nest sites vary with species actually, but it could be like an old mammal hole, an old mouse hole, and she will often scare out the residents. I've seen footage of a queen in a nest box, in a bird nest box, actually fighting a blue tit to take over the box. So they're really feisty, and she'll get a little ball of pollen and nectar and lay her first eggs into that. But she will also fashion herself a little cup, which I think is absolutely miraculous, out of wax, secreted from her body. And she will fill that with nectar to sustain her while she's brooding the eggs. So an amazing level of behaviour, you know, for an insect. And she will go out and about foraging during this time, collecting pollen and nectar for herself, and also obviously to create a little ball of eggs there. And they will hatch into larvae and feed on that pollen and nectar. And then they will eventually, they'll molt, they'll get bigger and fatter, and eventually they will pupate you know, into a cocoon like a caterpillar, and out will emerge the adult bees. It takes about 2 to 3 weeks for the full process, and they will then emerge. And from that point, the worker females, so they're all female, they will take over all of the duties, cleaning the nest, building little wax cells for her to lay more eggs, collecting pollen, collecting nectar, etc., etc. So in the summer, from now, basically, you start to see lots and lots of workers, busy, busy, busy. And then towards the end of the cycle, the queen will start to lay eggs, which she doesn't fertilise, and they turn into little males, which will be smaller than her. And the males will, once they hatch out as adults, they will go off. They don't ever come back to the nest, and they don't do anything towards the keeping of the nest. They go off to find a queen from another nest, but obviously of the same species. Hardly any of them will be successful, but the ones that do, they will mate. And once those new daughter queens have, oh, I should say as well, at the same time, eggs are laid which turn into new daughter queens. They're fed more. There isn't any royal jelly, but they're fed much more and tended more, and they're much bigger than their sisters, and they become queens. And once the queen is mated, she will feed up, ready for the winter, and find a little spot to hibernate. And then she will hopefully in the spring, if she survives, wake up to start the cycle again. So that is a generalized cycle, and it can really help us in ID. And I'll go a little bit more into that just now. So for a start, the annual cycle of activity and cast activity helps you to know which cast you're seeing. The queens are a really good place to start. So I definitely say, you know, having done this course next spring, when they start coming out sort of from the beginning of March time, have a look, because they're quite easy to identify because they're relatively big for a start. And at that time, there are no workers or males to confuse the issue. They're often very fresh and brightly coloured. Workers and males can get very worn and faded, which makes it difficult. Like I said, they're easier for beginners. They show their nest finding behaviour, the zigzagging and rustling about in the undergrowth, typical of queens. They will sometimes be carrying pollen, and you can see her beautiful shiny pollen baskets on her hind leg there. And they make a noise, so you're often alerted to their presence before you see them, which can be quite useful. The workers are often smaller versions of their mothers, and emerge from now onwards, although it does vary slightly species to species. They tend to be extremely active. They're never just kind of lazing around. They're either nectaring to keep themselves going, or they're carrying loads of pollen. And you can see them coming and going. If you do come across the nest, you'll see them coming and going all the time. The males there is some sexual dimorphism in some bumblebee species, so the males have different colour patterns to the females of the same species, which can double our difficulties as recorders. They will appear later in the year. Of one particular species, there are males coming out now, although it is still very early. But by the end of the summer, there's lots of males of different species around. You never see a male with pollen. So if a bee is carrying pollen, it can only be a female. They tend to sit around on flowers drinking nectar much more, because that's the only thing that they need to do other than occasionally flying around to look for a queen. They're often much fluffier than their female relatives. And 4 of our common species have yellow moustaches and beards and longer antennae. We'll come back to that because it's quite important for ID. So you can begin to kind of key in to the different casts and what they're actually doing. Okay, so I am going to stop sharing. That's just the very beginning. And I'm going to ask if anybody, before we have a quick comfort break, has anybody got any questions? You can either put them in the chat or just holler. I'm really happy for you to unmute. Okay, we've got one from Rachel. How many years might a queen live? Oh, only 1, Rachel. So she'll only do 1 colony cycle and she's finished. She's good for nothing after that. Okay, so that's it. So she'll live from the late summer 1 year to late summer the next year, effectively. Yeah. Any other questions? Like I said, please feel free to shout out if you'd like to. How many in a nest? Yeah, that's a good question. Galaxy S7 there. So I'm just going to move that. So it depends on the species. So basically, compared to honeybees, very, very few. Because I understand that honeybees can have tens of thousands of workers in a nest. But bumblebees, some species, it might be as low as 50. So, for example, the shrill carder has very low numbers of workers. And for other species, it might be up to about 200. But if you had a bumblebee colony near, for example, a honeybee hive, they would be vastly outnumbered by the honeybees. So much lower numbers. Okay, what are the proportions of males and workers and queens? That's a good question, and I'm not 100% sure of the answer of that. Again, it varies from species to species. I think she lays about 16 eggs at a time, that sort of number, and she'll lay several batches, which of those turn into workers right through the colony life cycle. So you've got a constant renewal of the workers. But the males and the queens, the new queens, her daughters, there's only sort of one batch right at the end, so far fewer than the workers. Okay, and obviously the workers, she needs more workers because they have to supply all of the food and tend the nest and etc. etc. How many eggs roughly are laid? Yeah, so I answered that. So she'll keep going with laying these batches of eggs basically until the colony dies. And sometimes the colonies will kind of linger on. They'll just keep lingering on until the old queen and her workers just die off one by one. So it can vary a lot. And, you know, if the food supply runs out early in the year, then the colony will die out sooner. So it just depends, really. I hope that's answered that one. Hang on a minute. Oh, this is lots of questions. I had a group yesterday and I didn't have any questions. Yes, so that's a good question, Nikki. Can nests be in eaves of buildings or only in natural surroundings? Definitely both. So again, it really depends on species, Nikki. They have different preferences. So for example, the carder bees tend to nest on the surface of the ground in tussocky grass. So things like the rare carders, like the shrill carder and the moss and brown banded, have similar habitat preferences. And that's why they are a feature of very good conservation grasslands. But the tree bumblebee, which didn't come into the UK until 2001, actually, that naturally would nest in a hole in a tree. And so they have gone crazy colonising the UK because they love blue tip boxes because it mimics their natural habitat, and they also love holes in buildings. So tree bumblebees, common as muck, nesting in buildings. And like the buff-tail bumblebee really loves to nest underground, but it's not a natural digger. So that's where if you've got really good hedgerows with loads of small mammals, you've got better chance of lots of bumblebee nests because they will use those small mammal holes. Okay, so lots of differences for that, Nikki, depending on species. Does the queen mate with more than one male? Andy, as far as I know, as soon as she's mated, her priority in terms of her behaviour becomes feeding and hibernating. And actually not that much is known about the mating behaviour. It's not observed that often. So as far as we know, yeah, she'll only mate once. But I don't know if that's a definitive answer, and if more research will find that that's not the case. Okay, will nest sites be reused in subsequent years? Yes and no. They won't. It wouldn't be the case that new queens from that nest would come back to their home site. That, you know, again, as far as we know, that just doesn't happen. And the queens will actually tend to disperse once they're off, once they've pupated and emerged. They'll go off, and they, you know, again, there's a lot of academic research needed here on how do bumblebees disperse. And it is highly likely that it is queens that will fly quite a long way. I mean, bumblebees can fly a long way. So the nest may get reused if it's a great nest site, but it's very unlikely that it's a queen from the last nest, if you see what I mean. It's just coincidence that it's being used again because it's a good nest site, especially bird boxes. You know, it might get used by another colony. So I've answered Jeff's question, I hope. Do nest sites vary according to species? Yes, for sure. If I see a bumblebee which looks exhausted, can I help it in any way? Okay, so this comes up quite often. Sorry, I got distracted by the next question then. Can you help it in any way? Yeah. Do you know what? The bumblebees are often seen sitting on the ground looking a bit dozy and a bit sorry for themselves, but usually they're just cold and they need to warm up, and they'll quite happily sort themselves out as and when the sun comes out and as and when they're ready and they've sort of warmed themselves up and they're ready to go. So by and large, I would say just leave it and let nature take its course. Don't give them honey. It's not recommended by the trust because they wouldn't normally eat honey. You can offer them sugar water, and it's something like, you know, just mix a teaspoon of sugar in a bit of tepid water and see if they'll just gently take it off a cotton bud. Something like that's the easiest way. I have tried with a spoon and you end up sort of just getting the bee all sticky and it's a disaster. So cotton bud could be good, but very often they won't show any interest, but sometimes they will. So yeah, you can do a bit of sugar water if you feel you'd like to. And Rachel, so can you create potential nest sites by making a hole in the ground? Do you know what? Bumblebees are phenomenally good at avoiding any attempts for us to make artificial nest sites. The best thing you can do is to make your garden just a classic wildlife friendly garden. So have a good compost pile. If you've got hedges, let them grow underneath. So you encourage things like field voles and mice and shrews, etc. Putting up bird boxes, you're either going to get a bird or a tree bumblebee. And to be honest, the amount of phone calls we have about tree bumblebees in bird boxes, you're as good as chance get one. They are the most aggressive of all the bumbles, so treat that with caution. But if you leave them alone, they're brilliant to watch. Yeah, so I mean, you could try making a hole in the ground, but the general consensus is that it's quite hard to get them to use an artificial site. They're quite fussy. So yeah, and I think they like the kind of chamber of mammal nests as well, because their nests tend to be an untidy ball of wax cells, like about the size of a tennis ball. So they like something that's a bit more chambered than just a hole. Yeah, I think that's it. Brilliant questions. Good. Oh, I know what I wanted to say as well. To the person who asked about helping a bumblebee, I know what I forgot to say was that if you see one like on a path, obviously, if you can gently get a leaf or something, especially if it's a female, and just move it out of the way so it doesn't get squished. But also, one thing I've done a few times is I've actually put it on a flower, so a bumblebee friendly flower, and you know, it'll tuck in. So I've got a lot of winter flowering heather in my garden, which is in full bloom, sort of, you know, March, April type time. And I've put queens on there before and they'll tuck straight in. So that's another thing you can do, which is probably a little bit more natural. Okay. And thank you, Rachel. I'm glad you like the illustrations. I'm not sure who did them actually. Okay, right. So I'm going to share again now. And we'll get a bit more into some ID this time. So when you are a complete beginner, which some of you are from the poll, there's a set of questions that you need to ask yourself, really, before you get to ID into species. And after a while, you don't have to bother with these questions because you'll go straight to identification. But they are useful when you're starting out. So first of all, you need to decide if what you're seeing is a bee, because it might not be. Then we need to think, is it actually a bumblebee? Because that's what, in this instance, we're going to be recording, hopefully. So you want to make sure it's not a solitary or a honeybee. Is it male or is it female? So it's really useful to, when we're recording, to know the sex. Is it a cuckoo or a social bumblebee? That's a bit harder. And then can we, once we've eliminated some of those things, can we get species? Okay, so here's two insects that I photographed up near, well, up on the Preseli Hills in Pembrokeshire. I was going to say which pub it was near, but you wouldn't know because you don't live down here. But yeah, so two insects on the same plant, Cotoneaster, within a few minutes of each other. Can you, if you'd like to, put in the chat which you think is the bumblebee, or just have a little look at them and answer it in your own head. So which one is the bee? Which one is not the bee? I shouldn't have used A and B, should I? I should have used X and Y or something. Okay. Yeah, all the answers coming in are correct. Yeah, good. Okay, good. So, yes. Oh, let me just check again. Haha. Okay, so yeah, okay. Not everybody's completely sure, which is how I would expect for this course. Yes, it is Galaxy 7, definitely. So actually, most of you did know, some of you didn't, that B is the bumblebee, well, a bee. And A is, as some of you said, is a hoverfly. I think it's Volucella bumbilans, I think, which is an absolutely phenomenally good bumblebee mimic. And it actually has another colour form with an all black and a red tail, which mimics the red tail bumblebee. Oh, they're so cool. So yes, hoverflies can be tricksy. And in these two images, this time the bee is on the left and the fly is on the right. And obviously that fly is a phenomenal mimic of that bee. The banding is almost identical. So how do we tell them apart when we're beginners? The thing I feel to look at with hoverflies, these bee mimics, is the head. And diagrammatically, these show the differences between a hoverbee and a hoverfly and a bee head. So they're both insects, but the hoverfly, the compound eyes are huge and they almost meet in the middle of the head, and the antennae are smaller in comparison to the bee antennae. In the bee, the compound eyes are much more lateral, just on the sides there, with the antennae very much in between the eyes and a big gap on the top of the head. So you soon get your eye in on that. Hoverflies have quite different flight and behaviour, but that just comes with seeing both insects in the field a lot. And hoverflies only have one pair of wings, whereas bees have two. And hoverflies hold their wings more sort of in an arrow shape when on a flower, and bees fold them over their back. But look at the heads and that will really, really give you a clue. And I'll just go back so So you can see very big compound eyes, tiny antennae, and in the bee, the lateral compound eyes with a longer antennae. Okay. So once you are pretty confident that you have a bee, you've got another sort of 270 odd species to decide whether or not it's one of the 24 bumblebees or not. Bumblebees in general are bigger and fluffier and noisier than any of the solitary bees. Oh, I've just given the answer away anyway by pointing at it. A is the bumblebee, and B, C, and D are all solitary bees. Okay. B in particular is the most bumblebee-like, I think, of all the solitary bees, and that's a hairy-footed flower bee. A female with a black, round, fuzzy body and orangey black legs. But this is a species that is, there's no bumblebee with those colourings, with the orange-haired back legs like that. So you soon get to know your solitary bees from your bumblebees. Okay, I think the flies are actually harder sometimes. So just recapping on some of the things I mentioned earlier, if we're trying to get the sex of our bumblebee, which can help with identification, in general, males are fluffier and scruffier. 4 of our 8 species have a yellow face, as I said before. Their legs are spindly and hairier, especially those hind legs. They're not visible in that image, but I will go over that later. They have longer antennae than the females. They never carry pollen, and they tend to have lazier behaviour. So they do flit about. They do flit about from flower to flower, but they're always nectaring, never collecting pollen, and they'll often just sort of sit on big flowers like knapweed and nectar for quite a long time. And the females, this is queen buff-tailed bumblebee, and they are generally neater. Some species are fluffy, but generally neater. They've got the shiny hind leg there, which is their pollen basket, and it can often glint like a mirror like that in the sun, whereas the males are all hairy on the surface. The females only have hairs on the edge of the pollen basket, which help to keep the pollen lump in place. They may be carrying pollen. They have shorter, more upright antennae than the males, often quite sort of in a sort of quite rigid V form sometimes. You can see the hairs in the pot there the same. The males are often quite droopy, and the females are often busier and buzzier. Okay, this is all we're going to do on cuckoos today, is just to make you aware, so don't worry about this at all. And I think Elaine has got a cuckoo ID sheet for you, which will be of more use next week. She may have already sent out. But the cuckoos, if you remember what I said, there's no differentiation with queens and workers, so you just get males and females, and the females are generally really fearsome looking, and in most cuckoo species they are really big because they have to fight to take over a nest, so they're quite like tough little cookies. They often appear quite dark without any middle banding, so you get a collar and a tail depending on species. They sometimes have darkened wings, and in some species they're almost black, so that can be indicative that you might have a cuckoo bee. All of their legs are spindly and hairy, no pollen baskets in males or females, because the females get the workers of the host nest to do the work for them, okay, right from the beginning, so she doesn't collect pollen at all. They're more sparsely haired, and I mean, I'm sort of surmising that that's because, you know, it's almost like an evolutionary process. They don't need to collect pollen anymore. So it could be partly due to that, and you can see the integument shining through on this one, which is quite common with cuckoos. Their movements can appear quite lumbering. It's quite distinctive. You might see them crawling around on dandelions in the spring, and they really are quite slow and awkward looking. And the more you get out looking at them, the more that you notice that sort of subtle behaviour difference. But that comes with kind of experience of seeing bees in the field, really. So cuckoos are very interesting, I think. So once you're pretty confident that you've got a bumble and you can have a go at IDing it, we use a suite of clues really to help us come to a decision. And in the Bumblebee Conservation Trust, all of our publications on ID lead on tail colour. So for the common 8, we look at tail colour, and then we separate, we separate according to that. So we put them in groups, which we're going to do in a minute. Then we look at banding, and the other things we've already had a look at. We have, we can look at facial hair, what colour it is. We can look at the shape and the hairiness of the legs, the length of the antennae. And there are also the more subtle and tricky clues of behaviour and seasonality, but they can really help when you put it all together. And even when you're really experienced, you still use all of those clues when coming to a decision on species, if you're not quite sure about something. Size, I really need to change this slide, because the more I do this talk, the more I realise that I talk about size a lot. So it says there it's not very useful for bumblebees, which is kind of true, because there is variation within species. So the queens are the biggest. The workers the males, tend to be about 2/3 the size, queen of the size for the queen, but the workers really do vary. Even within a colony, you can get tiny workers that are so small, it's hard to believe it's a bumblebee. And then later on in the cycle, you might get bigger ones that have been fed more, and they're almost as big as their mother. So there is a lot of variation, but in general, some species tend to be smaller than others, which I will mention in the species descriptions. And yeah, nutrition has a lot to do with it. So looking at some of the clues in that little fan, starting with tail colour. So I'm not going to talk about any specific species here. I'm just going to talk about that feature of looking at the tail. So we don't only look at the actual colour itself, but also the extent of the colour. So all of these species here, we talk about as being red-tailed. But actually, in the early bumblebee, the red tail is barely noticeable. In the red-tailed bumblebee, and a couple of other species as well, which are similar, it goes about 1/3 of the way up the abdomen. But in the bilberry bumblebee, which is one of the most beautiful species, it's way over half the abdomen. And it's the number of segments that it covers is what determines that extent. So very often we might see like a red-tailed male looks a lot like a bilberry bumblebee, but the extent of red is less. So we'd be looking at the extent of the colour. Okay. The banding, we'll look at not only the number of bands to distinguish species, but also the position. So in the white-tailed bumblebee, for example, we have 2 yellow bands, one on the thorax and one on the abdomen. Oops, didn't mean to do that. And the one on the abdomen is about just above halfway, over the halfway line of the abdomen. In the tree bumblebee, there are 1, 2, 3 yellow bands, and here we've got 2 on the thorax and 1 at the top of the abdomen, right along the waistline. So actually in flight, it looks like it has 2, with this one right across the middle, but it's actually 3. Okay, 1, 2, 3. That can be confusing. And in this cuckoo bee, it also has 2 yellow bands, but the second one is right above the white tail. Okay, so we look at number and position. Faces we've already touched upon. They're relatively easy to see. These are all photographs that I've taken while out and about. And they have brilliant faces. I really do love them. And as we've already said, if it's got a yellow moustache like this, then you've got a male. There is one species, the bilberry bumblebee, which we're not going to be doing. The females can have a couple of yellow hairs on this face, but nothing like this really distinctive moustache. Okay, so straight away, if you've got a male with a yellow face, you know that it can only be one of 4 species of the common bees, bumblebees. So it helps you, all of these things just help you to narrow it down, process of elimination. Face shape, you can see this bee has a very horsey face shape. It's a garden bumblebee, which we'll come to again when we look at that species. Okay, and as I've already said, anything carrying pollen is female, 100%. Ooh. And we won't go into too much detail of each of these, but basically, if you look at the bottom here, female social bumblebees have shiny, non-hairy surfaces to their legs, but male social bumblebees and male and female cuckoos all have hairy, spindly legs. And this is more intermediate identification really, but it is helpful to be able to recognise these shiny pollen baskets in the female social bumblebees. It really is. And you literally can, if you have them in a tube, whatever, you can actually get them to glint in the sun, so you know you have a female. And again, their antennae, the females there, they're 12 segmented, so they're shorter and more upright, and the males are much longer and droopier. It took me years to get my eye in on these, but most people that I do training with get it straight away. So that's really, really helpful. As I said earlier, female social bumblebees busy working, and they might fly low looking for nests, and they might even rummage around in the undergrowth. And the males and cuckoos will often feed even in a group. You rarely see females doing this, but you do see males and cuckoo males. These are in fact all hanging around together, and they'll be quite static because they're quite good for photographs. Okay, so the big 8. So all we're going to do today is the queens of the big 8, because they're the least variable, and then next week we'll do the males and the workers as well, but we've got them all on this little graphic. So we separate them by and large by tail colour. So I have been a bit naughty, which I'll explain in a minute. So all of these 4 on the left, these 4 species, we'd say they have white tails, even though the buff tail actually has a creamy tail. So for Bumblebee Conservation Trust literature, these are the white tails. Also over here, we've got an odd one, which I've put in the gingery column, but that does have a white tail as well. So I'll come back to that in a minute. So the first column, we've got white tails, and both of these queens, so the queens are all on the left, have 2 yellow stripes in both of those species. But in the buff tail, the yellow is much sort of more orangey and like a marmalade stripe, if you like. And in the white tail, the yellow is lemony. So the next column, we just look at the queens here on the left. And these are white-tailed bumblebees, both species, with 3 yellow stripes. 1, 2, 3. And we have the garden bumblebee, which is really common and widespread. And we have the heath bumblebee, which is more restricted. It's the most restricted of the 8, which really favours areas with heather, coastal heathlands or uplands. But it's doing okay, the heath bumblebee, so you can see it in the right sort of habitat. And I'll come to the differences between those two in a minute. And then third column, we have what classed as the 2 common red-tailed bumblebees. The top one is the early bumblebee, which has a little tip to its, little red tip to its tail, and then 1, 2 yellow stripes in the queen. And the red-tailed bumblebee is very distinctive with her bright red, more extensive red tail and all black body. We'll ignore the male for now. Okay. And then the 2 gingery bumblebees, which I put together because they're easily confused in the field. So the top one is the very distinctive tree bumblebee with a gingery, russety thorax, really striking bee, this one. Black, just over half of a black abdomen and a snowy white tail. And then underneath, our only common all ginger bee is the common carder. Okay. And here we have queens of each species. So we'll start with the buff tail and the white tail. So both of these have the same colour pattern. I'm just repeating what I've just said. Slightly more buff in the buff tail as compared to the snowy white of the white tail. And she has marmalade stripes. And the white tail has lovely bright lemon yellow. Okay, so the buff tail, it has the same pattern, but it's darker. It's a darker looking bee. And these are the ones that you really see at sort of beginning of March. They're really loud, really big. The queens are generally big of this species. I don't see the white-tailed so much down here in Pembrokeshire, but I do see it a lot up on the Preseli Hills and on the coast. So I would say it's not as common in gardens, certainly not around me. It's not quite as widespread as the buff-tail, but there are plenty of them around. Okay, so moving on to the 2 red tails, if you go remember back to the columns, we've got the red tail bumblebee, which has a beautiful, stunning third of its abdomen red and then all black. Remember, these are just the queens. And the early bumblebee, which just has a little peachy bottom there, little orangey red tip to her abdomen, and then 2 bright yellow lovely stripes. The early bumblebee is the smallest of our British bumblebee species. So on average, the queens and the workers are smaller, quite noticeably smaller than the other red-tailed bee, and a lot smaller, for example, than the buff-tail. Very, very pretty though, very fluffy species. And then going down to the bottom 2, these are the species with a white tail and then 3 yellow stripes, 1 on the abdomen and 2 on the thorax. And the ones in the middle meet like a band across the waist, like a belt. Okay, and we've got the garden bumblebee, which is by far the most common of these 2, with a super long face. I took some pictures today, actually, I'll put up on our Buzzing Wales Twitter account. They can access the longest flowers, that species, because they have the longest tongue and they need the longest face to accommodate that tongue. And then the heath bumblebee, smaller. And the distinction here is that the heath bumblebee has a small heart-shaped face as opposed to this very long horsey face of the garden bumblebee. And it is quite noticeable to be able to tell these 2 apart. And the heath likes to be on heather, so there's a bit of a habitat clue there as well. And then last but not least, the 2 gingeries, the common carder, which is lovely bright sort of gingery thorax, but with very distinctive cream on the sides and underneath. And the abdomen can appear quite dark. It has a lot of black, all mixed in with a ginger, but never ever a white tail. And in contrast, the tree bumblebee has a very similar coloured thorax, black on the abdomen, and always a snowy white tail. But it's surprisingly easy to confuse those two in the field. Okay, both common in gardens. You will see both in the same sort of locality. Okay. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to give you a chance to identify some queen bumblebees. Hopefully you shouldn't find this too difficult at all, because I've put some pictures in to help you. I'm just going to check that everyone's all right in the chat. Grant, yes, you can. Don't worry, you might have already gone actually. Sorry, Grant's just left. Yeah. Okay. Yes, Nikki, they will. Yeah, we can get them to you. So, okay, I'm going to get you to have a guess at these, an educated guess. You can put the answer in the chat. So what I suggest is for each, these are only queens, so you don't have to worry about anything else. And we just have the queens illustrated around the edge. Look at the tail colour first. Decide if it's a red tail or a white tail or whatever. And then once you've decided, for example, if this is a red tail, then you're going to go down to the bottom left-hand corner and look at stripes, and then you should be able to get it. Oh, your chat's filling up. This might be a bit too easy, but if you're a complete beginner, it just helps. We'll make it harder next week. So yeah, that is an early bumblebee queen. Sometimes people actually mix it up with a buff tail, because the buff tail can look almost like that, but in the field this would look a lot smaller and brighter than a buff tail. Okay. Oh, these are going to be a bit too easy for you all, I think, but never mind. Oh, I think I've gone. No, that's right. Sorry. Okay, so what about that one? Have a go. Pop it in the chat or just do it in your head. I'll give you a little while so everyone has a chance. So look at the tail. It's a little bit misleading, that tail, but it isn't really snowy white. It's more of a creamy colour. Yeah, common carder queen. Like I say, I'm sorry if some of you are a lot past this level, but it's, you know, just to build everyone up to the same level, really. And have a go at that one. That's really, really easy. There are two other much more scarce species which look exactly like that, but they are very, very rarely seen. Yeah, everybody's saying red tail, as I would hope, so that's good. And that one. So go for tail colour first. Obviously a queen with an active nest because she's laden with pollen. Look at tail colour first and then look at the number of yellow bands and their position. Yep, all the right answers coming in. So she's got a pure white tail, so we go to the right, and she's got one yellow band in the middle. Okay. So we're almost done. So that's another white tail. I'll move on from that one. So white tail and two yellow stripes. That's a white tail queen. What about this one? What about that one? Can't see its tail. So what do you think? Pop it in the chat or Andrew, I'll answer your question in a bit. Yeah. Yeah, all saying buff tail with a question. Yeah, it is a buff tail. You know, with a photograph like that, it's difficult if it was a more tricky species, but that's got the total look of a buff tail with its marmalade-y stripes. And you can see that that second stripe is part way back from the waist. So there's not really anything else it could be, but it's difficult if you don't get an image of the tail when it's a harder identification. And Andrea, yes, I'll go over the photographs in a minute, but it is definitely good to submit a photograph with a record. This one you should all get with no problems. So this is the one that I've put in the kind of wrong section, if you like. Oh, the chat's filled up really quickly. Yeah, that's a tree bumblebee, super distinctive with its russety red thorax and white tail. Good, good. Okay, and just a couple more slides left. So this one on photographing bumblebees. Yeah, Andrea's just asked about submitting photographs with Bumblebee records. Yes, yes, please, definitely. It helps enormously. And if you're a new recorder, the verifying team on iRecord, which also verifies on the Lurk Wales app, which we'll go over in detail next week, they are, you know, they're fussy, they're rightly fussy. They're not going to let data through that isn't correct. So if you're a new Bumblebee recorder, you know, they'll be wanting to see that you've got a photograph and that you've got it right. And if you think of the features that I've told you about in terms of banding, position, tail colour, a photograph from the top often doesn't show all of that. So if you've only got time for one photograph, trying to make a profile shot like that is really, really useful, because we can see tail colour, we can see legs, you can often see the shape of the face, and you can see any bands as well. So that's a really good one. This is a nice image, but actually what bumblebee is that? Well, it could be a buff tail, could be an early bumblebee queen. We don't know because we can't see a tail, we can't see the head. So I'm fairly sure that is a buff tail, but I wouldn't like to call it from an early bumblebee actually. So yeah, that's not such a good shot for ID. So anything's better than nothing. That's another more sideways shot. That's a brown banded carder, one of the rare ones. And you can see the lovely brown band and lots of paleness on that species. That's not a bad sort of profile shot, if you like. Faces are brilliant to get as long as you get the rest of the bee as well. That one doesn't tell us really which carder that is. But it gives us a good view of the face. And if you've got a really, really accommodating little chap like this one, you know, take a few, take one from above, take a profile shot like this, take a detail of the head, take a detail of the tail, and then we can, this is a male cuckoo, I think it's a possibly a Barbett's cuckoo bee. Male's very difficult in the cuckoo bees. But yeah, that one was particularly placid, so I was able to get a lot of photographs. Okay, and I'm going to ask you to do something for next week. If you've got time and inclination, this has worked really well with the other groups. So a couple of things. One is check out the ID pages at the Bumblebee Conservation Trust website, so you get a bit more of a handle on some of the things I've said. And the other thing, if you get a chance, could you take a photograph of a bumblebee and send it to me and tell me something about it? And that could depend on what level you're at. So, you know, if you're really unsure and not confident and you just want to say it's a bumblebee as opposed to a hoverfly, that's fine. if you can sex it, that would be brilliant. And if you can tell me the species, that would be great. Hopefully I've given you enough information that you can start telling the species. So if you could do that, send it straight to me. I'll give you my email in a sec. Well, I'll give it to you now, actually. I think it's on the next one. Yeah, send it straight to me at clare.flynn@bumblebeeconservation.org. And on that note, it would be really great if I could have your emails from Elaine. If you don't want to share your email with me, that's absolutely fine. But I'd like to add it to my project mailing list so that you have information, because I'm going to do lots more courses, like online courses like setting up a bee walk and introduction to the rare carders and all sorts of things. So it'd be great to have your details if you're happy to give them to me, and then I can store them on my little database, which is all under GDPR guidelines, so it's all kept very safe and not shared with anyone else. But yeah, send your pictures. If you can just send, you know, what one bee rather than a load. I won't reply individually, but I will try and include them all in next week's presentation, and we can go through them and see how you got on, and I'll do it anonymously. So that would be brilliant. And I'm going to stop sharing now, and we can have that's wrong. Get rid of that. Stop share. And I'm going to have a look in the chat. And if you've got a question, now's a good time. Elaine's put my email in the chat, so that's good.
I think the second one's right. Sorry, I got it wrong the first time.
Let's have a look. Yeah, bumblebeeconservation.org, that's correct. So I'm just going to go back. Yeah, so from Richard, what lens do you use? Well, very often, Richard, you won't believe this, but it's often my phone.
Oh, great. Okay.
But I've got a Leica lens on my phone. So I have got a really good point and shoot Olympus TG6. And a lot of these were done on a Canon Sure-Shot G16, which is also a point and shoot with a really good macro function. But what I've learned with bee photography, because I've got kids and dogs and everything else, and I'm often actually out looking for bees when I'm walking the dogs or picking up the kids from wherever, I invested in a secondhand Huawei P20 Pro, which has a double Leica lens. And it just means that I can, whatever I'm doing, like Tesco car park, you know, wherever I am, I've got that decent camera on me to snap bumblebees. So not all of these are with that, but some of them are. I mean, it's not as good as a proper camera, but it's good enough. And it's got, you know, brilliant macro, and you can take a very good quality image and zoom in and crop it. So that's really nice. And also it really helps me in the field because I've got the Lurk Whales app on there. I've got my GPS. I've got a notepad on there. So I know not smartphones aren't for everyone, and I know they can be an absolute pain in the neck. But the last few years, I've found my smartphone a really good tool for bumblebee recording. Okay. Let's have a look. What else we've got here? Wings, cats. Yes, is the answer. They absolutely do. But not for bumblebees. Once you get to species level, we use wing pattern when we are identifying solitary bees. So it's very, very much microscope work. So when you get to using wings, you do have to take a specimen. But all bumblebee species have pretty much the same venation. So the only use for that is separating them from solitaries. And you can do that by eye anyway, so you don't need to do it. But if you move on to solitary bee identification, you can only get so far with field work, and then it becomes impossible. And that's when you use your wing venation. Okay, the solitary bees have very distinctive, you basically use the wings to get solitary bees to genus, and then you use other features to get them to species. So I hope that helps, Kat. Right, what else we got? So we've got a sweet net. If we struggle to photograph them in flowers, but what is the best way to hold them for pics? So, Chris, I will go over this next week, and I'm not doing any specific field sessions with Elaine this year, but there might be other opportunities for you to come out with me. And I will, like I said, I will show you equipment next week. And next week, I will make a note to go into a bit of detail with that for you, how you pot them in glass pots, which can be really useful for photographing in the field. With the males, you can hold them very gently by the legs without harming them. I still struggle with that a little bit, but it's absolutely fine. They'll just fly off afterwards. But obviously you can't do that with the females, so it's harder. A good thing is to get into watching them on particular flowers, and where they will sit for longer. So things with a lot of availability of nectar, like perennial cornflowers, the females will often sit for a bit longer on those sorts of things, and then you can have got a better chance of a good image. But other than that, it's netting and potting. Okay. I think thank you, Nikki. Yeah, I think that's all the questions in the chat. Anyone, any more before we all go off for a cup of cocoa or whatever you might be going for this evening?
I've got a couple more. Somebody asked if the photographs can include a video. We're going to be talking more about the recording technology next week, but unfortunately it doesn't support video. But what you can do, if you're feeling fancy, is to upload a small video to a third-party site like YouTube, and then include a link in your comments, and then the verifiers can go and visit that and look at your video, but you can't directly add one to iRecord or the app.
That's good. Yeah, that's good to know about the link. I mean, I'd say, knowing the verifiers that I know in the bee community, it's interesting actually. I might actually, because Richard, my boss in this particular role, is one of the UK verifiers. So I will ask Richard about the videos and try and get that info back to you next week. My instinct is that they'd probably prefer photos anyway, if you can get decent ones, because it's just much simpler, because they have like thousands of records to verify, and they're not going to be want to go into YouTube to look at a video, because their time, like everybody's, is precious. But, you know, I'll ask that question and see what Richard says. My dog has just come in.
Andy asked if how you're going to get the email. So if everybody's happy, I'll send Claire the list of email addresses, so you don't need to do anything at your end.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, and like I said, just let Elaine know if you'd rather not it be spread around to Bumblebee Conservation. Okay.
And Monica's asked, what is the lowest temperature they can fly at? I'll leave that one to you, Claire.
Oh, that's a good question. Quite fairly low actually, because bumblebees, I don't know the exact temperature, but bumblebees are really, really super cold adapted, and which is part of the reason they're so fluffy. And it's actually thought they probably evolved, you know, somewhere in the Himalayas in quite cold regions. And if you go out on quite a cool day to, you know, sort of even in the winter when in the early spring, when the queens emerge, you know, you're well below 10 degrees C sometimes that they come out and fly, and they occur right up to the Arctic Circle. So I don't know the exact one, or even if there is an exact one, because I suppose it'll vary from individual to individual in terms of what they've consumed in way of nectar and their size as well, you know, their surface area to volume ratio, but they hold quite a warm temperature inside their bodies. So yeah, they're quite effective at low temps, but can't give you a definite answer. Yeah.
Brilliant.
Okay, right. Well, it's nearly 8:20, so I think if everyone, there's one more. Will I find bees out now this evening whilst it's still light? Well, I'm looking with my hot shot. Highly unlikely. Yeah, the dusk. Well, it's coming to dusk. You may, but I think it's unlikely now. I think they'll be tucked up in their nests, getting ready for tomorrow. But in the high summer, the evening is really good because they are so cold adapted. They actually don't like really hot sunny days. So in the high summer, the evening is a really good time to look for bumblebees, opposite with solitaries. Yeah. Okay. I hope that's answered everything. And, you know, I'm still learning. But even if I don't know the answer, I know who to ask. So, yeah, we'll, diolch Nikki and Nostar, and see you next week.